At first light in Normandy, the landscape carried the uneasy stillness that often settles between bombardments. In a small German forward observation post, two soldiers studied the hedgerows through misted field glasses, noting the slow movement of an American truck easing into a clearing. Nothing about it suggested alarm. Its canvas cover hung loosely, its engine idled with the tired rhythm of routine logistics. To the men watching, it was simply another vehicle threading its way through the bocage maze. Harmless, forgettable, unremarkable. But the calm fractured in an instant. A roar, metallic and rising, ripped across the air with no warning. The truck's frame seemed to shudder as a cluster of crude launch rails spewed fire. Dozens of rockets clawed upward at sharp angles, leaving twisting black spirals that clawed at the morning sky. For a moment, the Germans could only stare. Nothing in their manuals, nothing in their briefings, explained a weapon like this. Confusion spread along the infantry line. Some men dove for cover, convinced they were under attack from aircraft they could not see. Others pressed themselves against the earth, expecting the rockets to fall upon them. Yet the projectiles sailed overhead, trailing smoke like frantic brushstrokes before crashing deep behind the German front. A delayed rumble shivered through the ground, subtle at first, then widening as if the soil itself had flinched. Within minutes, battalion headquarters received reports from startled units positioned miles apart. They spoke of flying iron pipes, of explosions arriving without the familiar prelude of artillery whistles. Runners demanded clarification. Radio operators repeated their questions. Commanders insisted on identification. Which American division fields such a device? How many do they possess? How close are they now? The narrator widens the frame. What the Germans had witnessed was not polished engineering. It was an improvised machine, assembled from pipes, rails, and borrowed ideas, yet capable of rewriting local firepower in a single morning. Crude, unstable, and unpredictable, it nonetheless signaled the arrival of a new kind of battlefield pressure. And far from that quiet hedgerow, other units were preparing to unleash the same invention, long before anyone understood how profoundly it would distort the rhythm of the campaign ahead. Across the German lines, officers began exchanging hurried warnings, each message sharpening the sense that something unfamiliar had entered the battlefield. The Americans, they insisted, had deployed a mobile weapon reminiscent of the feared Nebelwerfer, a device known less for its accuracy than for the terror carried in its howl. That such technology might now be mounted on trucks unsettled commanders who believed they already understood the contours of Allied firepower. Instead, the morning's barrage suggested that those contours were shifting in ways they had not anticipated. Intelligence staffs searched their files for any reference to American rocket artillery programs, but the shelves held nothing useful. No dossiers, no intercepted documents, no prior reports hinting that the United States was experimenting with field-launch rocket systems. The absence of information proved more alarming than any confirmed sighting. It implied that the enemy had been preparing an entire class of weapons beyond the reach of German reconnaissance. Among frontline soldiers, the descriptions grew more visceral. Men spoke of a sound like a furnace erupting, a rolling blast of heat and pressure that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The rockets' erratic paths made them difficult to trace, and their smoke spirals left only thin clues. What unnerved the infantry was not merely the destruction, but the uncertainty, an attack that arrived without a signature they could learn to read. Reconnaissance patrols attempted to find the source and returned with reports that only deepened the confusion. They described ordinary trucks, civilian pattern, unarmored, almost improvised, with rough metal rails welded to their beds. Such vehicles seemed too crude to inflict the chaos witnessed hours earlier. Yet the evidence was undeniable. These makeshift platforms had delivered a blow disproportionate to their construction. From these fragments, a legend began to form. Rumors transformed scattered sightings into a conviction that the United States was mass-producing a new generation of mechanized rocket launchers. The gap between perception and reality widened with remarkable speed, carried by fear rather than fact. And in that widening space lay the central paradox. How a simple truck, built from necessity, was already becoming a psychological weapon far more potent than the steel it launched. A paradox that the next phase of the campaign would only intensify. Within German headquarters, analysts pored over fragmentary reports, convinced they were witnessing the unveiling of a concealed American modernization effort. To them, no army fielded a weapon of such disruptive effect without years of planning behind it. They assumed the rockets seen in Normandy were the surface trace of a deeper program, one shaped by laboratories, doctrinal committees, and an industrial base capable of reshaping the rhythm of artillery warfare. The conclusion felt logical, even inevitable. The United States must be entering a new phase of technological escalation. These assumptions led naturally to comparison with their own Nebelwerfer brigades. German officers imagined that the Americans had developed a counterpart, similar in function, perhaps superior in deployment. They expected the accuracy, dispersion patterns, and tactical doctrine to mirror their own rocket artillery units. Such projections were comforting in their symmetry. In war, familiar shapes offer the illusion of understanding, even when the reality is shifting beneath them. Yet aerial reconnaissance complicated the picture. Despite sustained searches, no large stockpiles of American rockets were found. No centralized depots, no standardized launch vehicles. The air photos revealed only scattered trucks, each looking slightly different from the next. Analysts struggled to reconcile these irregularities with their assumptions. What they could not see from altitude was the truth. These weapons were improvised locally, built in workshops near the front, assembled by soldiers and mechanics responding to the immediate demands of combat. Still, the narrative hardened. Intelligence dossiers began labeling ordinary truck convoys as rocket batteries, inflating the scale of the threat with every misidentification. A handful of modified vehicles expanded into the specter of a mechanized rocket force advancing across the bocage. In this way, a modest battlefield innovation grew into a perceived strategic shift, a change in the war's trajectory born as much from fear as from evidence. The narrator widens the frame once more. What the Germans never grasped was that the system they feared had no central design authority, no master blueprint. It began with a simple necessity, the need for more firepower without adding more guns, and that humble origin would soon lead to a revelation neither side yet fully understood. By the middle of 1943, the United States found itself confronting a paradox of abundance. Its factories were producing more shells, guns, and vehicles than any nation in history, yet the global scale of the war consumed them faster than industry could replenish. American divisions spread across North Africa, the Central Pacific, and the Mediterranean sent the same message home. Artillery was never where it needed to be soon enough. Firepower, once the foundation of American battlefield doctrine, was becoming a resource strained by distance, terrain, and tempo. Commanders in the field voiced their frustrations with increasing urgency. Conventional batteries, efficient on static fronts, struggled to reposition across deserts, jungles, or the rugged slopes of Italy. In an era of accelerating mobility, a weapon that required time to emplace, register, and protect was slowly diverging from the demands of the battlefield. Each relocation meant lost hours. Each lost hour meant enemy positions that reshaped themselves before American guns could respond. Infantry battalions, bearing the first cost of this delay, began requesting something different. A weapon able to flood an area with explosives in seconds, even if precision suffered. They needed a tool to break ambushes, scatter counterattacks, and collapse fortified pockets without relying on the slow orchestration of traditional artillery fire missions. It was a plea born from hard experience, a recognition that speed, not refinement, had become the missing ingredient in divisional firepower. In workshops and proving grounds, Army engineers sifted through possibilities. Captured Soviet rocket systems, crude yet devastating at close range, offered one path. Early U.S. naval rockets, designed for beach assaults, provided another. Neither was elegant. Both, however, suggested that explosive force could be delivered rapidly without heavy gun barrels or complex recoil mechanisms. What rockets lacked in accuracy, they compensated for in sheer volume and immediacy. The conclusion that followed was almost disarmingly simple. Rocket tubes were cheap. Trucks were everywhere. If soldiers could mount rails on the beds of vehicles already assigned to supply trains or engineering units, then rocket artillery could appear almost overnight. No new factories, no bureaucratic delay, just steel pipes, welding torches, and the willingness to accept imperfection in pursuit of speed. Out of this emerged a doctrine shaped by necessity. Fire once, relocate instantly, and deny the enemy any hope of counter-battery fire. The Americans understood that their rockets would wander, drift, and scatter, but they believed mobility could compensate, turning accuracy into saturation, and saturation into tactical momentum. Place the blast where the enemy least expected it, then move before they could respond. And from those early experiments, a belief quietly took root. That agility itself could become a weapon, one capable of redrawing the relationship between firepower and movement. A belief that, in the months ahead, would collide with German assumptions in ways neither side yet fully imagined. To understand the emergence of America's improvised rocket trucks, one must first understand a cultural divide that ran deeper than technology. Germany entered the war with a tradition of precision, of weapons engineered to exact standards, calibrated for accuracy, and deployed according to doctrine polished across decades. The United States, by contrast, embraced a wartime mindset that valued speed, quantity, and the flexible use of whatever materials lay close at hand. In 1944, this difference was not subtle. It shaped how each nation solved problems and how quickly those solutions reached the front. American commanders were under no illusion about the limitations of rockets. They knew the projectiles would drift in wind, scatter across impact zones, and seldom land where mathematics claimed they should. Yet they also recognized a truth the Germans often resisted. An inaccurate weapon used in overwhelming volume could achieve effects no single precision strike could match. Saturation fire could stun an enemy, break cohesion, and create openings for infantry before counter-battery fire even began. It was the speed of delivery, not the elegance of the trajectory, that mattered most. This practicality appealed strongly to frontline officers. Many had watched new recruits struggle to master the intricacies of conventional artillery procedures. Rockets were different. They required little training, no recalculated firing tables, and only a basic understanding of range and deflection. A launch crew could learn the system in an afternoon, then operate it effectively under combat pressure. For weary battalions, that simplicity carried an unmistakable promise: more firepower sooner. The workshops that supported these divisions took the concept further. Mechanics sketched plans that reduced the launch platform to its most essential form: steel rails bolted or welded onto the beds of ordinary 2.5-ton trucks. These vehicles were already ubiquitous across the theater, delivering fuel, food, and ammunition. Converting them into mobile rocket launchers required no specialized equipment, only materials drawn from supply depots and the improvisational skill of soldiers accustomed to repairing their own fortunes. Quartermasters, often cautious by necessity, found little reason to object. The system demanded no redesign of existing logistics. It consumed no rare alloys. It used rockets already in production for naval forces. In a war where every new weapon threatened to strain supply lines, this one blended seamlessly into structures already in motion. Efficiency, rather than innovation alone, became its greatest asset. Behind these decisions lay a deeper belief woven into the American approach to global war. That adaptability outweighs elegance, and the side that adjusts fastest gains the advantage. It was a philosophy born from industrial confidence and battlefield pragmatism, a philosophy that would soon collide with German expectations, shaped by an entirely different tradition. And in that collision, the assumptions forged in distant headquarters would begin to unravel, one improvised salvo at a time. When the first prototypes were rolled onto isolated test ranges, anticipation quickly gave way to unease. The rockets leapt from their rails with a violence that surprised even their creators, twisting unpredictably as they carved erratic paths across the sky. Some buried themselves harmlessly in distant sandbanks, others veered sideways, detonating far from their intended arcs. Observers recorded the results with quiet frustration. Accuracy, the traditional measure of artillery strength, seemed hopelessly out of reach. Yet amid the chaos, a different insight emerged, one that could not be measured by blast radius alone. Engineers noticed how the sudden ignition, the tearing scream of the rockets, and the scatter of smoke trails created an emotional shock far out of proportion to the physical damage inflicted. The weapon unsettled its audience, even when misfired. It produced a sensory pressure that lingered. In a war shaped increasingly by momentum and morale, that realization carried weight. As more tests were conducted, commanders began to recognize the true potential hidden within the system's instability. A single truck might spray fragmentation across a wide, uncertain field. But a dozen trucks, firing in synchronized salvos, created something different, a wall of noise and concussion that overwhelmed perception itself. The collective shock mattered more than the path of any individ. Yule rocket. In that moment, inaccuracy transformed from a flaw into a characteristic of the weapon's identity. Word spread quickly through infantry units, many of which had grown accustomed to fighting without the immediacy of heavy fire support. What the prototypes lacked in refinement, they offered in volume and urgency. Soldiers requested them not because they trusted the engineering, but because they understood the psychological rupture such weapons could impose on an entrenched enemy. The demand came from the front, not from theory. Practical soldiers, familiar with the constant compromise of field conditions, began altering the launch rails themselves. They scavenged scrap metal from wrecked vehicles, ammunition crates, and bridge trusses, welding and bolting pieces into configurations that differed from unit to unit. No two trucks looked entirely alike, yet each served the same purpose: to hurl as many rockets as quickly as possible before moving again. In this way, the weapon evolved through direct experience, shaped by weather, terrain, and the ingenuity of the hands that built it. Doctrine followed, not from laboratories or formal committees, but from the accumulated memory of battles fought under pressure. Officers concluded that a weapon did not need perfection to influence the field. It needed only to be reliable enough, numerous enough, and fast enough to shift an engagement's rhythm. Good enough, they realized, could shape operations when multiplied across an army. And soon, the first improvised trucks would leave the test ranges behind, carrying this philosophy toward a front line where expectation and underestimation waited to collide. Along the shifting battlefronts of 1944, places never intended for innovation began assuming the role of hidden laboratories. Truck depots, usually quiet zones of maintenance and resupply, transformed almost overnight into hubs of mechanical invention. Frontline mechanics, men accustomed to coaxing tired engines back to life, now found themselves shaping the future of American firepower. Their tools were familiar: welding torches, scrap steel, and the instinctive understanding of what machinery could endure under strain. But their mission had changed. What began as routine repairs evolved into an improvised campaign of weapons development carried out at the speed of war. Welders experimented first with the angles of the launch rails. The earliest prototypes had fired rockets in tight, narrow patterns, magnifying every flaw in the projectile's unpredictable flight. The mechanics recognized this as a limitation. By widening the rails outward and adjusting their elevation, they discovered they could stretch the salvo across broad sections of terrain. What looked imprecise on blueprints proved incredibly effective in practice. A single truck could now saturate a hedgerow, a village edge, or a suspected machine gun nest rather than aim for one uncertain point. The spread itself became the weapon. Behind them, supply clerks worked with equal ingenuity. They dug through forgotten inventories and discovered large stocks of Navy 4.5-inch rockets, munitions originally built for aircraft and coastal operations. These rockets had been judged too inconsistent for precision air missions, but for ground salvos they were ideal. The clerks requisitioned them quietly, bypassing layers of bureaucracy simply by understanding how the paperwork flowed. In a war measured in tonnage and timetables, this subtle redirection of supply gave frontline units an arsenal the Army had never formally assigned to them. Field officers, observing the rapid evolution of these trucks, began drafting what could loosely be described as manuals. These were not doctrinal documents written in the polished language of the War Department. They were field notes, penciled diagrams, instructions scribbled between patrol reports, and paragraphs refined after each battle. Trial and error shaped every line. Officers learned to position the trucks behind embankments to shield the backblast, to pre-mark escape routes for immediate relocation, and to stagger firing so that smoke never revealed the entire battery at once. The manuals were crude, but they fit the spirit of the weapon: functional, flexible, and shaped by necessity. Ammunition crews added their own innovations. Early firings had revealed a frustrating inconsistency. Some rockets ignited cleanly, while others sputtered or hesitated, throwing timing off by seconds. The crews began adjusting their loading sequences, brushing carbon deposits from the rails, applying improvised lubricants, and sorting rockets by batch to reduce variance. Their refinements produced salvos that sounded less like disjointed eruptions and more like a rolling wave. It was still far from scientific, but it brought the system closer to reliability without slowing its production. With each experiment, confidence grew. Units started coordinating their trucks into synchronized G-lines, aligning their launch angles so that dozens of rockets ascended together, their exhaust merging into a single searing plume. The effect was astonishing. Enemy positions struck by these barrages reported not only the physical destruction, but a sense of disorientation. an overwhelming perception that the entire horizon had turned hostile in an instant. The psychological dimension of the weapon, hinted at in the first tests, became unmistakable when multiplied across a front. And so, without ceremonies or official announcements, a new branch of ad hoc artillery took shape. It had no formal name, no dedicated insignia, no governing doctrine. It existed because the soldiers needed it, and because America's industrial abundance could supply the raw pieces even if it could not supply the finished design. These trucks, hand-built in scattered workshops, became instruments of both innovation and improvisation, artillery born not from laboratories, but from the restless ingenuity of men operating under fire. What no one yet realized was how this quiet evolution, unfolding far from headquarters, was laying the groundwork for a shift in battlefield psychology, one that would soon ripple outward, reshaping not only tactics, but the enemy's confidence in their own understanding of the war. The next encounters would reveal just how fragile those assumptions had become. Long before the first improvised rocket trucks entered combat, a quieter truth had already shaped their destiny. They were born not from laboratories or technical revolutions, but from the vast logistical machine the United States had constructed across two oceans. Traditional artillery depended on shell foundries, brass casings, and precise machining, each step vulnerable to bottlenecks that strained even America's industrial might. Rocket systems slipped around those constraints entirely. Their bodies required less metal, their propellant needed fewer specialized chemicals, and their assembly lines moved with a speed that conventional ammunition could never match. In a war defined by scale, this difference mattered. Supporting these rockets was an asset even more abundant than explosives: trucks. No army fielded more of them than the United States. By 1944, the 2.5-ton truck had become the unheralded signature of American power, a vehicle so common that its presence faded into the landscape. Yet its ubiquity offered something unprecedented. A single truck could be a supply hauler one week, a troop carrier the next, and, after an afternoon in a workshop, an artillery platform capable of delivering a barrage that once required a dedicated battery. Mobility was no longer a desirable trait. It was the foundation upon which the weapon system stood. Fuel convoys tied this mobility together. Long columns of tankers, escorted by MPs and repair teams, wound their way from ports to depots and then to the front. They ensured that rocket launchers could reposition as soon as they fired, often moving before German intelligence could identify their firing position. The trucks were not merely fast, they were unpredictable. Their routes shifted, their staging points changed. Their ability to leap across terrain forced German analysts to revise assumptions faster than reports could be filed. Every gallon of fuel purchased another hour of invisibility. Even the rockets themselves were stacked with logistical intent. Artillery shells were heavy, awkward cylinders demanding careful packaging and significant storage space. Rocket crates, by contrast, fitted neatly into truck beds, warehouse corners, and makeshift ammunition dumps. Their square edges allowed for denser stacking, meaning a single convoy could deliver far more firepower per ton than traditional shell shipments. The mathematics of supply had shifted. Mobility and efficiency now complemented each other. On the front lines, repair crews adapted seamlessly to the rhythm of the new weapon. When rails bent, welders straightened them. When rockets scorched the wooden planks beneath the launch racks, carpenters reinforced them with scavenged steel plates. A system that might have stalled under laboratory conditions instead thrived under battlefield improvisation. Crews measured downtime in hours, not days. The trucks remained in near-constant service, firing, moving, firing again, ghosts that refused to stay still long enough for counter-battery fire to find them. As more units adopted the technique, entire battalions began learning the choreography of shoot and scoot. They rehearsed firing sequences until the motions resembled muscle memory. Engines idling, rails tilted, fuses checked, rockets loaded, ignition triggered. Moments later, as the last plume of smoke drifted upward, trucks were already rolling towards secondary positions. German counter-battery radars and sound-ranging teams were left pursuing echoes. The Americans had not out-engineered them. They had outmoved them. In time, commanders recognized the sim. Plea but transformative truth. Logistics, not engineering, had become the decisive factor. The rockets were crude. The trucks were ordinary. The rails were handmade. But the network behind them, fuel, transport, spare parts, manpower, had no equal. America's ability to supply, maintain, and reposition these improvised launchers gave them a strategic weight far beyond their technical sophistication. And as the system matured, a question emerged quietly among those watching from the opposing side. If such an improvised weapon could thrive on the backbone of American supply, what might happen when that same system supported tools of far greater precision? The next phase of the war would begin to answer that question, one barrage at a time. For the infantry who fought across the hedgerows of France, the first true revelation came not from theory, but from the earth itself. Entrenched German positions, buried into the dark soil, protected by vegetation and interlocking fire, had resisted artillery barrages for weeks. Then, in a single afternoon, a line of rocket trucks opened fire. The rockets tore through the hedgerow walls with startling speed, shredding foliage that had concealed machine gun teams only seconds before. What traditional guns accomplished slowly and methodically, the rockets achieved in a moment of violent clarity. Soldiers who had braced for drawn-out assaults found the way suddenly open. Night operations offered an even more unsettling display. Against the black canvas of the battlefield, the rockets left burning trails that curled upward like molten wire. Their reflections flickered off helmets and shattered windows, casting jagged shadows that seemed to animate the very landscape. German defenders, accustomed to reading the battlefield by sound, found themselves overwhelmed by light. The searing glare disoriented patrols, masking the direction of the attack and dissolving the sense of where danger truly lay. For American infantry, the night, once a realm of hesitation, became a stage for shock and confusion directed outward. Ranger units, trained for missions that required precision under extreme pressure, quickly recognized the rocket trucks as tools that could reshape the first minutes of a landing or crossing. On narrow beaches where enemy fire was concentrated, rockets created corridors of upheaved sand and shattered timber. Along riverbanks, they suppressed defenders long enough for assault boats to push off without being torn apart. These were not weapons of exactness. They were weapons that punched holes in time, granting seconds of advantage when seconds meant survival. Commanders soon realized that rockets offered something rarer still, ambiguity. Their salvos could mimic the opening moves of a major offensive. By varying range and density, they could make a battalion sound like a corps. On quiet nights, rocket fire across a distant ridge might convince the enemy that an entire front was shifting. Deception operations that once relied on dummy tanks and staged radio chatter now possessed a sound and fury that felt unmistakably real. The rockets became both weapon and message. Among the troops, morale shifted in ways difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. Soldiers understood that the Germans still possessed formidable artillery. They knew their enemies could marshal precision fire whenever the front stagnated. But rockets offered something the enemy could not match: speed. A unit pinned down in the morning might have rocket support within minutes. A patrol ambushed at dusk could call for a salvo that arrived almost before the echoes of the first shot had faded. Firepower was no longer a distant promise. It was a companion that traveled with them. Over time, the sound of a rocket barrage developed a second meaning. It no longer represented only the start of an attack. It signaled confidence. Planners began incorporating rocket salvos into the very rhythm of their offensives. A series of rapid bursts might precede a breakthrough attempt. A heavy, rolling fire could announce a push toward a river line. Even the troops who had grown accustomed to the noise still felt its pulse ripple through the ranks. Where rockets fired, movement followed. The narrator steps back. Something fundamental had changed. The Americans had discovered that shock, delivered not as panic but as deliberate tactical design, could tilt the balance of a fight. Rockets were crude, unpredictable, and often wasteful. Yet in the hands of the infantry, they became instruments of momentum, expanding the battlefield in ways artillery alone never had. And soon, as the front pressed deeper into occupied territory, this new mastery of shock would collide with German defenses that believed they had already accounted for every American trick, every weapon, every pattern, every flaw. They had not. In the dense bocage of Normandy, where hedgerows rose like walls and every field felt enclosed by centuries of cultivation, German in fan. Try prepared for the familiar sounds of American firepower, the shells of traditional batteries, the rolling thunder of naval guns, the distant hum of aircraft. What they heard instead was something they could not place, an abrupt, layered roar that seemed to tear open the morning. A moment later, rockets plunged into the hedgerow lines with a violence that felt almost directionless, exploding across an impossibly wide arc. For the first time, German soldiers faced the weapon that had taken shape in distant workshops, far from their intelligence reports. The effect was immediate. Units trained to fight within the contained geometry of the bocage found their coordination unraveling. Rockets shattered earthen embankments and punched into tree roots that had stood for generations, sending debris and dust swirling through positions designed for concealment. Communications broke down as runners faltered, and radios went silent beneath the overlapping blasts. The salvos did not feel methodical, as artillery usually did. They felt simultaneous, overwhelming, as if the battlefield had seized control from both sides. German commanders, receiving fragmented reports, assumed they were under bombardment from a concentrated array of heavy guns, perhaps several battalions firing in coordinated unison. The scale of the disruption seemed too great for a new or improvised weapon. Men accustomed to distinguishing between calibers by sound found their instincts failing them. This disorientation mattered more than the physical damage. Misinterpretation fed uncertainty, and uncertainty opened gaps no fortification could mend. American armor was ready for those gaps. As the rockets fell, tank columns pushed forward along narrow lanes that had resisted advance for days. German anti-tank teams, blinded by smoke and shaken by the unpredictable salvos, found themselves reacting seconds too late. Shermans broke through intersection points where fire control had once been tight and disciplined. Now, coordination faltered, replaced by the instinct to find cover before another wave of rockets arrived. Momentum, long trapped in the hedgerows, belonged suddenly, decisively to the attackers. The rocket trucks themselves rarely remained in sight long enough for the enemy to form a picture of their operation. Concealed in orchards, behind barn walls, or along sunken paths, they fired their salvos and vanished within minutes. By the time Luftwaffe patrols arrived to investigate, the trucks were already kilometers away, hidden among the sprawling networks of supply convoys that fed the American push inland. To German pilots scanning the patchwork terrain, the weapon left no silhouette, no signature, only smoke trails already dissipating in the Normandy wind. Observers on the ground documented what they could. They noted the speed with which the trucks repositioned, the irregular spacing of firing points, the absence of any fixed battery layout. This mobility, more than the rockets themselves, emerged as the defining feature. The Americans had introduced a system that refused to be pinned down. It did not behave like artillery in the traditional sense. It behaved like movement given explosive form. In headquarters farther from the front, analysts struggled to reconcile these reports with their prior expectations. They had prepared for American firepower to increase in volume, reach, and accuracy, but not to evolve in this direction, not to fracture the rhythm of engagement so thoroughly. Slowly, a realization spread through the command hierarchy. Their assumptions about American artillery, shaped by years of conflict and doctrine, no longer held. The battlefield had shifted beneath them. The turning point was subtle but unmistakable. Germany's understanding of the enemy had been rooted in a belief that American power relied on predictable patterns, on massed guns, deliberate preparation, and the weight of industrial precision. Here in the hedgerows of Normandy, that belief collapsed. The rockets were crude. Their accuracy remained questionable, yet their psychological and tactical effects far outstripped their engineering. They created disruption faster than defenses could compensate, and in that disruption, American forces found room to maneuver. The narrator steps back. Normandy did not simply introduce a new weapon. It revealed a new American approach, one that fused mobility with shock, improvisation with logistics, and speed with overwhelming effect. The Germans had expected heavy artillery. What arrived instead was a weapon that rewrote the tempo of the battlefield. And as the front began to stretch toward the interior of France, another, deeper question took shape, one the Germans had little time to answer. If this improvised system could break their expectations so completely, what other surprises lay hidden behind the lines, waiting for their moment to ignite? By late July 1944, the American advance in Normandy had slowed to a crawl. The hedge. Heroes that once framed quiet French farms had become fortresses, each one concealing machine gun nests, anti-tank guns, and infantry who had learned to survive the fiercest artillery fire. Operation Cobra was meant to shatter this deadlock. But before the tanks moved, and before the infantry rose from their ditches, another force gathered, one that had grown from improvised beginnings into something far larger. Hundreds of rocket launchers, some engineered, many handcrafted, now formed an invisible line behind the front. When the operation began, the sky itself seemed to react. Aircraft thundered overhead, delivering the opening blows of a bombardment unlike anything the campaign had yet seen. The air vibrated with concussions as bombs descended in rolling sequences. But even that immense aerial strike did not define the moment. What followed did. From orchards, clearings, roadside embankments, and camouflaged depots, rocket launchers, formal batteries, and improvised truck arrays alike released their salvos with a timing plan to merge with the aerial assault. The sound was unlike conventional fire. It was rower, broader, almost mechanical in its fury. Rockets surged out in waves, leaving spirals of smoke that twisted into the turbulence left by the bombers. German survivors would later describe the experience as a storm without origin, a sensation of being battered by explosive force that seemed to arrive from every direction at once. Nothing in their training, not even the screeching barrages of their own Nebelwerfers, had prepared them for the simultaneous assault of air, land, and rocket fire converging on a single defensive line. In the German positions, the effects were immediate and disorienting. Anti-tank gunners, normally the backbone of defensive depth, struggled to keep their weapons aligned. Blast waves toppled rangefinders, scattered ammunition, and forced crews to shield themselves rather than aim. Communication lines that had survived the bombing dissolved under the rocket onslaught, leaving platoons isolated and uncertain whether the fire marked a local attack or the collapse of the entire front. The saturation, not the precision, proved catastrophic. American armor, waiting behind the barrage, sensed the moment when the ground tremors eased and the opportunity opened. Tank columns surged forward, engines roaring as they crossed gaps now stripped of coordinated resistance. German fire appeared only in pockets, stubborn knots of defenders who happened to lie in areas the rockets had missed or overshot. Everywhere else, the defensive rhythm had fractured. The once reliable sequence of spotting, ranging, and firing had been replaced with hesitation, the brief but fatal pause of men who had lost the sense of where the enemy was and how close his advance had come. As armored divisions rolled through the shattered front, reports traveled quickly up the chain of command. Observers on the ground described entire sectors caving under the shock of the bombardment. Staff officers whispered estimates that the Americans had found a way to devastate square kilometers in minutes. Some believed the new weapon was controlled by centralized batteries hidden beyond reconnaissance range. Others speculated it was an airborne system, too fast to be tracked. Few imagined that many of the rockets came from trucks assembled in workshops scarcely miles from the front. The myth grew faster than the explanation. German commanders attempting to regroup became wary of any lull in the artillery pattern, uncertain whether it preceded another rocket wave. Counterattacks scheduled to restore defensive cohesion faltered before they began. The psychological weight of the weapon, its noise, its unpredictability, its reach, hung over the battlefield even when the launchers were silent. For the Americans, Cobra became the moment when improvisation matured into strategy. The rocket trucks, once viewed as stopgap tools born from shortages and necessity, now operated alongside engineered systems in coordinated roles. Their presence altered planning meetings, shaped the sequencing of offensives, and gave division commanders a new instrument: shock delivered at scale without waiting for the heavy guns to reposition. The crude rails and improvised launch beds mattered less than the effect they produced, an effect felt not only in the earth, but in the minds of those who attempted to stand against them. As the breakout widened and American forces poured through the corridor their fire had opened, the meaning of the rockets shifted once more. They were no longer simply weapons of disruption. They had become catalysts, forces that transformed tactical openings into operational breakthroughs. What began as scattered experiments now defined the tempo of the campaign. And as the German lines reeled westward, one question lingered among both armies. If this was what American improvisation looked like in the summer of 1944, what might it evolve into as the war pressed toward the heart of Europe? As the American advance spilled beyond the hedgerows and into the open roads of France, the rocket trucks moved with a freedom they had never enjoyed in Normandy. No longer boxed in by earthen walls, they accompanied armored columns through liberated towns, weaving between tanks, half-tracks, and supply convoys with the easy rhythm of machines designed for motion. Their rails, scorched and darkened from constant firing, became an unmistakable symbol to troops who understood what followed when those rails aligned toward the horizon. For German commanders, the challenge deepened with every mile the Americans gained. The rockets did not follow predictable schedules or conventional patterns. Some salvos fell at dawn, others erupted in the middle of quiet afternoons. A few were fired deliberately off-axis to confuse observers tracking their arcs. What the Germans long relied on, anticipation, began to slip from their grasp. Without knowing when or where the next barrage would arrive, defensive planning dissolved into guesswork. Counter-battery teams, trained to triangulate artillery positions with precision, found themselves powerless. The rockets' launch signatures were brief, their smoke dissipated quickly, and the trucks were already on the move before sound-ranging equipment could assemble a coherent reading. Radar crews fared no better. The fleeting ignition produced only erratic traces, impossible to interpret before the vehicles vanished into the dust clouds trailing the American advance. The result was a weapon that existed everywhere and nowhere, present long enough to strike, absent long enough to avoid reprisal. Along the backroads and river crossings where German rearguards attempted ambushes, the rockets altered the very meaning of engagement. Small pockets of defenders would prepare to spring their traps, only to hear the low, rising hiss in the distance, the prelude they had come to dread. Moments later, rockets swept through the tree lines, scattering formations before they could reposition. Ambushes that might have stalled columns for hours dissolved in seconds, their intended momentum stolen before it could gather force. To the Americans, it felt as though the rockets were clearing the path ahead. To the Germans, it felt like their battlefield autonomy was disappearing. Civilians who witnessed the liberation of their towns recalled the rockets with a mix of fear and fascination. They described the haunting sigh that drifted across fields just before a salvo struck, a sound distinct from artillery and different from aircraft. Many remembered the eerie pause afterward, no guns visible, no launchers left behind, only the approach of American troops advancing through the smoke. For them, the rockets became part of the soundscape of liberation, an omen that the front had shifted and that German control was breaking apart. Inside German ranks, morale faltered in ways that no report could quantify. Rumors spread that the Americans possessed thousands of rocket trucks, 10 times the real number. Soldiers insisted they had seen simultaneous barrages from different directions, convinced the U.S. Army had created mobile rocket divisions capable of overwhelming any defensive line in minutes. Leaders tried to correct these misconceptions, but the psychological damage was already done. The mere possibility of unseen launchers lurking beyond each hilltop eroded discipline and fed a sense of inevitability about the American advance. Through it all, mobility remained the Americans' greatest advantage. The trucks required no elaborate setup, no survey teams, no protected firing posts. They stopped, fired, and moved on, in an offensive defined by speed, where distances that once took days now shrank to hours. The rockets amplified every gain. Tanks broke lines, infantry secured objectives, and the rocket trucks ensured that any attempt by the Germans to regroup or counterattack was met with swift, disorienting force. By late summer, the pattern was unmistakable. What began as an improvised solution to artillery shortages had become a decisive offensive multiplier. The rockets did not win battles on their own, but they shaped the conditions in which victories unfolded. They denied the enemy time. They disrupted the logic of German tactics. They allowed the Americans to move faster than doctrine predicted, faster than defenses could adapt. And as the front pushed toward the borders of the Reich, one truth settled quietly across both armies. The weapon Germany could not counter was not simply the rocket itself, but the movement behind it, a momentum that was still building, preparing to test the limits of everything that came next. By the autumn of 1944, German artillery officers found themselves rewriting doctrines they had once considered immovable. The American rocket salvos, erratic, overwhelming, and impossible to predict, forced a reassessment of everything from battery placement to the timing of counterfire. Traditional assumptions about enemy preparation no longer applied. Openings that once signaled an upcoming barrage now meant little. The rockets could appear without warning, fired from trucks that left no reliable footprint. The battlefield, once mapped by logic and experience, had become a place of fluid uncertainties. In frontline positions, infantry commanders adopted new spacing patterns to survive the saturation fire. Units that once fought shoulder to shoulder dispersed across wider stretches of ground, trading cohesion for survival. This dilution weakened their defensive fabric. Trenches no longer supported one another as they once had. Machine gun nests that depended on overlapping arcs now sat at distances that blunted their combined effect. The Germans could adapt to the rockets' destructiveness only by weakening the very structure that had made their defenses formidable. Fallback positions shifted as well. Officers ordered deeper secondary lines, spaced farther behind the main front, hoping that sudden rocket strikes would not cripple both layers at once. These precautions, however, imposed their own cost. Each extra meter placed between formations made coordination slower, counterattacks less decisive, and the defensive logic more brittle. It was an irony of the war. To avoid destruction at the hands of a weapon valued more for shock than precision, the Germans altered their battlefield geometry in ways that made it harder to resist the broader Allied advance. On the roads and fields behind the lines, reconnaissance teams faced a different dilemma. Every American truck sighting, supply vehicles, maintenance rigs, even ambulances, became a potential threat in the German imagination. Reports of possible rocket launchers multiplied, saturating intelligence channels and forcing commanders to chase ghosts. Patrols were diverted from meaningful objectives toward phantom targets, and each false alarm drained the already scarce resources of a shrinking military machine. The rockets did not merely obscure their launch signatures, they obscured the Germans' understanding of the battlefield itself. This fear carried across multiple fronts. In some sectors, German units halted movements at the sound of distant ignition, assuming a barrage was imminent even when none followed. In others, commanders postponed counterattacks until they were certain the rocket trucks had relocated, a certainty that rarely existed. The psychological weight of the weapon had begun to exceed its physical reach. It altered tempo, decision-making, and response cycles. The Germans were no longer reacting to American fire. They were reacting to the possibility of it. American planners saw the shift almost as soon as it began. Reconnaissance photographs captured German formations stretched thinner, roadblocks abandoned prematurely, and fallback lines established in places too deep to influence the immediate fight. Reports from the front confirmed increased hesitation, small pauses in enemy behavior that, when multiplied across divisions, created exploitable openings. The Americans did not need the rockets to collapse the German defenses outright. They needed only the hesitation that followed the memory of their fire. In this way, the rockets reshaped the rhythm of engagements far beyond their crude mechanics. They compressed the Germans' window for action while expanding the Americans' freedom to maneuver. They weakened cohesion without ever striking every position. They forced doctrinal revisions that drained focus from the larger operational picture. And most importantly, they changed how the battlefield felt, its timing, its expectations, its sense of what could happen next. The narrator steps back. A weapon designed for simplicity and speed had achieved something rare. It had altered perception itself, bending German assumptions in ways that no artillery piece or tank breakthrough had accomplished. And as winter approached, the question grew sharper. How long could an army endure when even its understanding of the battlefield began to erode? In the years after the war, when analysts sifted through captured documents and battlefield reports, the story of the American rocket trucks emerged as one of the conflict's quiet paradoxes. The weapons were undeniably crude, assemblies of steel rails, surplus rockets, and trucks never designed for combat. Yet the operational record told a different tale. These improvised platforms had altered campaigns, shifted doctrines, and forced a rethinking of how firepower could be delivered in a fast-moving war. Their simplicity had become a source of advantage rather than a limitation. Post-war planners studying the Normandy breakout found that the rockets' true power lay not in their destructive capability, but in their ability to synchronize with air strikes and armor thrusts, creating moments of overwhelming pressure. This insight would echo into the early Cold War, where American designers sought new systems capable of delivering saturation fire across large operational fronts. The MGR-1 Honest John, the United States' first nuclear-capable surface-to-surface rocket, owed more to these improvised trucks than its engineers initially admitted. It inherited the same philosophy: mobility as a multiplier, shock as a shaping force, and payloads delivered without the machinery of heavy artillery. Decades later, the lineage became clearer still in the development of the multiple launch rocket system. MLRS, with its coordinated firing pods and rapid relocation doctrine, reflected principles born in the hedgerows of France. Its creators emphasized responsiveness over precision, volume over singular impact, and adaptability over rigid planning. What had once been an emergency solution, welded together in the margins of the war, had become a formal branch of American firepower, tested, refined, and eventually institutionalized. Army historians reviewing the European campaign concluded that mobility, not sheer firepower, had driven the rocket's success. A salvo could disrupt, confuse, and fracture an enemy position, but it was the ability to fire and vanish before counter-battery teams reacted that made the system transformative. The trucks moved at the speed of opportunity, not at the pace of doctrine, and in that mobility lay the foundation of an entirely new operational logic. Firepower became a fluid element rather than a static one, capable of appearing at any point along a front with almost no warning. The simplicity of the wartime design left its mark as well. Cold War theorists studying saturation bombardment noted that a weapon did not need to be technically perfect to be strategically disruptive. It needed only to be reliable enough to multiply across an army and flexible enough to adapt to terrain, weather, and circumstance. In classrooms and command schools, instructors pointed to the wartime rocket trucks as evidence that improvisation, when supported by strong logistics, could reshape operations as effectively as any breakthrough in engineering. Among veterans, the memory of those weapons carried a different resonance. Many recalled the strange pride of firing rockets built in their own workshops, assembled by the same hands that repaired trucks and welded armor plates. The weapons felt personal, part tool, part invention, part symbol of what necessity had demanded of them. Some spoke of the weight that followed each salvo, the awareness that their creation, born of need and sweat, carried consequences far beyond the clearing where it had been built. Their reflections, offered years later, revealed an emotional bond rarely associated with artillery. German officers interviewed after the war admitted they had misjudged American ingenuity. They had expected efficiency, mass production, and standardized doctrine. Instead, they encountered an army willing to improvise, to adapt quickly, and to deploy weapons whose unpredictability made them difficult to counter. What unsettled them most was the realization that these rocket trucks represented not the upper limit of American capability, but a glimpse of what could emerge when necessity and creativity converged. The narrator steps back. The legacy of the improvised arsenal was not merely a chapter in the story of World War II. It was a preview of warfare's future, a reminder that innovation often begins in the margins, shaped less by perfection than by urgency. And as the Cold War dawned, nations on every continent would begin to explore what America had discovered in a quiet Normandy orchard. That mobility, multiplied across a battlefield, can transform even the simplest weapon into a force that changes the war around it. In the final accounting of the war, when historians sifted through the debris of shattered cities and broken armies, one truth emerged quietly but unmistakably. Some of the most consequential forces on the battlefield were built from the simplest materials. Steel rails welded by tired hands, wooden crates repurposed from supply depots, a truck engine designed for farms, freight lines, and long American highways. These were not the artifacts of a nation's highest engineering ambitions. They were the ordinary tools of an army that refused to let the limits of the moment define the outcome of a campaign. Great powers had entered the conflict believing that complexity would secure victory. They envisioned precision-guided strategies, meticulously crafted weapons, and doctrines shaped by years of theoretical refinement. Yet the field told another story. Complexity often collapsed under its own weight, while improvisation, raw, imperfect, immediate, found ways to endure. What reshaped battlefields was not always the polished weapon presented in a general's briefing, but the sudden adaptation forged by soldiers who understood that war rarely waits for perfection. The rockets themselves embodied this contradiction. Their inaccuracy frustrated engineers, puzzled commanders, and irritated those who attempted to measure their effectiveness in purely mathematical terms. Yet on the battlefield, their unpredictability became part of their identity. The erratic trajectories, the wide dispersions, the uncertain impacts, all mirrored the nature of war itself. Chaotic, indiscriminate, transformative. They reminded those who survived their barrages that conflict is never as orderly as doctrine promises. It bends, swells, and reshapes itself around human ingenuity and desperation. For the Germans who faced them, the physical damage was only half the story. The psychological tremor carried further. A unit struck by rockets often reported shock more than casualties, disorientation more than destruction. The salvos disrupted perception, blurred timing, and dissolved the defensive instincts drilled into soldiers since training camp. The fear preceded the explosions. The uncertainty lingered long after the echoes faded. In many engagements, the rockets achieved their purpose before a single projectile landed, forcing hesitation in the minds of men who could least afford it. Innovation in this chapter of the war did not come from distant laboratories staffed by specialists in white coats. It emerged from workshops hammered together beside hedgerows, from supply clerks who knew the inventory too well, from mechanics who could weld under fire, and from officers willing to test a weapon that did not yet have a name. These individuals refused stagnation. They refused to accept that the battlefield's constraints were fixed. Their creations were born of urgency, but sustained by intellect, an intellect untethered from rigid expectations. What ultimately endures from this story is not merely the weapon, but the lesson it carried. Superior technology can win battles, but flexible thinking wins campaigns. The rocket trucks were not superior in the traditional sense. They lacked accuracy, sophistication, and engineering elegance. Yet in their movement, in their adaptability, and in the psychological shadows they cast across the battlefield, they revealed an old truth made new again. War rewards those who adjust faster than their enemy understands what is happening. And so the story closes where it began, with simple materials repurposed into something far greater than their individual parts. A truck, a rail, a crate, a spark of ignition that changed the way armies moved, planned, and feared. From these unremarkable beginnings came a force that reshaped fronts, confounded intelligence, and rewrote doctrines. They were just trucks once. Germany never underestimated them again.